Hey everyone, welcome back to Bear It In Mind. This video is an exam paper walkthrough of the 2022 Paper 2 exam paper. I'm going to divide this up into 3 videos, one video for each of the 3 sections of the paper. In this first video, I'll give you an overview of the paper with some general tips and advice for Paper 2, and then at the end of the third video, I'll summarise some of the key lessons and takeaways. You'll find links to the exam paper and mark scheme in the description below, as well as links to videos on the approaches covered in these questions. Paper 2 contains 3 sections and they are always in the same order. Section A is approaches, Section B is biopsychology, and Section C is research methods. Section A and Section B are worth 24 marks, but research methods is worth double any other section with 48 marks. The exam is 2 hours long, so that means you're looking to spend 30 minutes on Section A, 30 minutes on Section B, and an hour on research methods. Each section is designed to assess you on a range of skills that include AO1, which is your knowledge and understanding, how accurately can you describe and outline theories and studies. AO2, how well can you apply your knowledge to the STEM given to you in the exam. AO3, how well can you evaluate and discuss theories and studies. Now before we dive into the first section, one thing you might want to do is have a quick flick through the exam paper at the very start of the exam. Look to see how many essay questions there are. Sometimes there are a number of 16-mark essays, or there might be a number of 8-mark questions. So let's flick through the paper now and see what we notice. For approaches, there is an 8-mark essay on self-actualization and conditions of worth, which relates to the humanistic approach. For biopsychology, there is a 16-mark essay on localization of function in the brain, and for research methods, there is a 12-mark design a study question at the end. Now that we have this overview of the paper, we can now explore Section A, the approaches. For each question, I recommend annotating it to help you carefully take note of what the question involves. At the basic level, you're looking for the command word, the topic, and the marks. I'll put a pause sign on the screen for each question to remind you to have a go yourself. Question 1 says, describe psychosexual stages as outlined in the psychodynamic approach, 6 marks. So here the command word is describe, so this is an AO1 skill. And for 6 marks, you need to ensure you provide enough detail and key terminology to gain all those marks. You may remember that Freud states there are 5 stages. Could you recall all of them with the mnemonic old age pensioners like gardening? If you have watched the video on the psychodynamic approach, you may remember this table summarizing all of the stages. So for this question, we could write about the oral stage, which happens between 0 and 1 years. Libido energy is directed towards the mouth, and the mouth is the first area to be associated with pleasure and satisfaction, mainly because of feeding. At this stage, the conflict to be resolved relates to weaning. The child must become less dependent on the caregiver for food, for example the mother's milk, and transition to other foods. If the child becomes fixated at this stage as an adult, this may show itself in behaviours such as sucking their thumb, smoking, drinking, and overeating to gain oral stimulation. The second stage is the anal stage from 2 to 3 years. Libido energy is directed towards the bladder and bowels. This time, the pleasure and satisfaction come from controlling bladder and bowel movement. At this stage, the conflict is toilet training, which enables them to develop control and independence. If toilet training is not handled sensitively, the child could become fixated at this stage, and as an adult, this could be seen in what Freud called having an anal retentive personality, where they may be excessively organised, tidy, obsessive, and concerned with bodily cleanliness. Third stage, phallic stage, between 3 to 5 years. The libido energy is on the genital area of the body. The word phallic relates to the word phallus, which means penis. For Freud, this is the central focus of this stage. This time, the pleasure and satisfaction come from the genitals, and at this stage, the conflict involves either the Oedipus or Electra complex. The fourth stage is the latency stage between 6 to 12 years. At this stage, the libido sexual energy is present, but generally calm. The development of the ego and superego at this point helps to make this stage calm. The focus is mainly on developing socially and intellectually, and fixation does not normally occur at this stage. Fifth stage, genital stage, 13 years on into adulthood. Libido becomes more active again during the onset of puberty. At this stage, you develop strong sexual interest in the opposite sex, and the development of the ego and superego continue to control and balance the urges to help behaviour be appropriate to the expectations of parents and society. That was an overview of all the stages, but you wouldn't need to write about all of them to get all 6 marks. It depends on the level of detail you include. 2 of them, at the level I described them, would be more than enough. Question 2. At a local school, teachers took part in Active Lifestyle Week to encourage students to become more active. The week involved daily staff netball matches during break times and a step count challenge. 2 of the teachers were talking at the end of the week, and Miss Honey said, "That was such a great week. I felt proud to win the staff step count challenge and receive the medal in assembly and demonstrate the joy of sport. My students loved watching us compete. I really think it will inspire them to be more active themselves." Mrs. Wilson replied, "It's all right for you. You're young and the students like you. My students were so embarrassed to see me tripping over in netball, I think I may have put them off the sport forever." Apart from mediational processes, use your knowledge of social learning theory to explain Miss Honey's and Mrs. Wilson's comments. 6 marks. The command word is explain, and the question requires you to apply it to the STEM, so this requires both AO1 and AO2, and it also clearly states that we cannot use mediational processes, but another feature of social learning theory. Because this is a question that requires AO1, knowledge of social learning theory, and AO2, application to the STEM, you could think about the 6 marks in terms of picking 2 or 3 features of social learning theory and applying each one to the STEM. In this case, the application is very specific as it needs to be applied to the comments of both teachers. Notice the word and. This was a really good example of needing to carefully annotate the question before you started writing. The examiner's report at this point is worth reading. Most students demonstrated knowledge of social learning theory, but were more challenged by the demand for effective application of their knowledge. The application given by some students did not extend much beyond directly quoting from the STEM, which made their answers limited. So here you could write about observational learning. For example, Miss Honey says, "I think it will inspire them to be more active themselves." This comment suggests that she believes her behaviour will influence the students' behaviour because the students watched and observed her playing the netball matches. Identification. This is when an observer associates themselves with a role model and wants to be like the role model. The students are more likely to identify and associate themselves with Miss Honey rather than Mrs. Wilson, as Mrs. Wilson said to Miss Honey, "You're young and the students like you." Vicarious reinforcement is reinforcement which is not directly experienced by us but occurs through observing someone else being reinforced for a behaviour. The students see Miss Honey rewarded for adopting a more active lifestyle. Miss Honey says, "I felt proud to win the staff step count challenge and receive the medal in assembly." And when students see Mrs. Wilson tripping over in netball, they will not want to imitate her and so will not adopt a more active lifestyle. Again, you wouldn't need all of these, perhaps 2 if you explained it well enough and you made sure to apply it to the comments of both Miss Honey and Mrs. Wilson's. Question 3. Whether or not students learn to be more active could depend on mediational processes. Explain how mediational processes might be involved in the students becoming more active. 4 marks. The command words are explain how for 4 marks and requires you to apply it to the students, so you've got to do more than just describe mediational processes. What are mediational processes? Well, they are the internal mental processes that come between stimulus and response, and according to Bandura, include attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. Applying each of these to the scenario, we could write something like this. Attention. The students will notice their teachers demonstrating a more active lifestyle. For example, they've watched the staff competing in netball matches during break time. They also saw Miss Honey receiving the medal for the step count challenge in an assembly. Retention. The students are more likely to remember the staff being more active because they had daily netball matches matches, and Mrs. Wilson tripping over in netball was a funny event that was highly memorable. Reproduction. The active behaviour that the students see the staff perform can be carried out by the students. For example, the step count challenge is a simple activity that does not require inaccessible equipment or a certain level of fitness to be able to perform. Motivation. The students are more likely to adopt the active lifestyle they observe in the staff if they perceive the rewards of winning the step count medal or the joy of the sport as outweighing any costs such as tripping over in netball. Really notice how specific the application is in each of those examples. Many students lose marks not because they lack the knowledge of mediational processes, but because they don't answer the question in the required way. Be specific with your application as to where it is in the STEM. And finally, question 4 says, discuss self-actualization and/or conditions of worth in explaining human behavior. 8 marks. The command word for this question is discuss, which typically means that we need to provide some knowledge of a theory or study, AO1, and then evaluate it in terms of strengths and limitations to form a discussion. A typical 16-mark discuss essay question is broken down into 6 marks for AO1 and 10 marks for AO3, so for an 8-mark discuss question this is halved, so 3 marks for AO1 and 5 marks for AO3. It's helpful to think about it in terms of 1 good paragraph of AO1 followed by 2 good paragraphs of AO3, and even better if those AO3 paragraphs can be for and against, evidence and then a counter argument. Now just before we think through what to write, this was different from your standard general essay question as they included specific named parts of the approaches. It's perhaps worth thinking about how other essay questions might be worded along similar lines for other approaches. Self-actualization and conditions of worth refer to the humanistic approach. In this question, you need to describe one or both of these for your AO1 marks and then discuss them specifically for your AO3 marks. In other words, make sure your evaluation directly relates to them, not simply evaluates the humanistic approach in general. So this essay will probably require a little bit of thought and planning before you dive into writing. Note the examiner's report on this question. Many students simply discussed the humanistic approach and issues and debates with no attempt to shape their answers to the specific question set, whilst others gave a series of generic evaluation points or focused entirely on knowledge. For the AO1, always start with the big picture before going into the details, but it's only for 3 marks, so you don't want to write more than you need to. So you could write that self-actualization and conditions of worth are features related to the humanistic approach and the work of Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Self-actualization is the innate desire to achieve or fulfill one's full potential, becoming what you are capable of. For Maslow, self-actualization is that the peak of the hierarchy of need, and in order to achieve self-actualization, the lower needs, also known as deficiency needs, must be met before an individual can attempt to satisfy their self-actualization needs. These include physiological, safety, love and belonging, and self-esteem needs. Now at this point we could then talk about what self-actualization looks like for Rogers with congruence, but because we only need 3 marks of AO1, I would move on to write about conditions of worth. So you could write something like this. Conditions of worth relates to Carl Rogers' work and is where standards are placed on the child by a parent which they believe must be met if they are to be accepted. An individual may experience a sense of self-acceptance only if they meet the expectations that others have set as conditions of acceptance. Now let's think through the AO3 evaluation. When I teach the approaches topic to my students, I try to get them to think about evaluating them using a set of headings, such as supporting evidence, practical application, research methods, debates, and comparisons. There are other evaluative points that you can use, but this makes life a little easier and simpler. 2 of these relate quite nicely to self-actualization and conditions of worth. So you could write about research methods. You could write about how the humanistic approach uses non-scientific research methods that is more interested in a person's subjective experiences, and as such there is a lack of scientific evidence for self-actualization and conditions of worth. Practical application. You could argue that Maslow's work into self-actualization has been practically applied to help businesses have an understanding of the needs of their employees and then how to best motivate them so that they are able to do their best work. Or you could talk about conditions of worth, which has shaped counselling therapy with the emphasis on counsellors behaving in a way that undoes the conditions of worth through unconditional positive regard, genuineness and empathy in order to increase the person's feelings of self-worth. An additional way you could evaluate is through considering cultural differences. This is because the humanistic approach has been criticised for being a product of an individualistic culture. This is seen in such terms as self-actualization, where the emphasis is on the individual and a person's growth, whereas in more collectivist cultures where the emphasis is much more on the group identity and the well-being of the community over the individual, concepts such as self-actualization might not apply. So that completes section A. Links to videos on any of the parts of the approaches covered in this video can be found below, and in the next video we'll go through section B on biopsychology. I hope you found this video helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.